What's good, YouTube? We are back with another tier list, but this time we are ranking all of the DPS specs on how fun they are. It is tier list season after all. Your boy Vesperal TV is back, T standing for tier list, by the way. I do just want to make note that this is obviously based on my opinion, and it is subjective as this is a fun tier list and it's not based on the power of the spec at all. But yeah, your opinions may well be very different to mine, but I think I hold an opinion that is widely held by a lot of people as well, so let's get involved. So as you can see, we have all the DPS specs lined up at the top. They're a bit jumbled up here, but we're just going to take it as it goes. We're going to start from the left. So we're going to start with the Fury Warrior. Now, I have actually tested out the Fury Warrior on PTR quite a bit, to be fair, but that was prior to the nerfs that they received, where you were able to generate max stacks on your Bloodthirst from the tier set every time you rampage, which made for a really fun and engaging gameplay loop. However, they have nerfed that recently, and now I believe it's every 2 or maybe even 3 rampages that you use will actually max stack your Bloodthirst. So it's not going to be that cyclical playstyle of Bloodthirst and Rampage, which felt very good. It felt very fun and still feels fun to see Bloodthirst actually doing some damage. I personally wasn't too much of a fan of the spamming Raging Blow in Season 1, having 3 charges of that, and it felt like you were never out of charges. So you always just spammed Raging Blow. But Fury is a good time. You basically don't have a global cooldown on this spec. I am in love with this spec. You have unlimited amounts of cooldowns that you also can get a lot of cooldown reduction on through your anger management talent. So being able to blast in every single pack in Mythic Plus feels great, especially with the cleave damage and also prio damage that the Fury Warrior brings. So for this bad boy, we are going to chuck it straight in the A tier. For me, it could have been a potential S tier spec if it hadn't just been nerfed already, and also the fact that I'm not too much of a fan of the warrior class fantasy. It is just a little bit bland to me. Some of the animations are sick, but at the end of the day, for me, it is pretty stale fantasy wise, because you're just a guy with some swords or axes. Titan's Grip does improve that class fantasy a little bit more for me, but unfortunately it is just a little too bland for me to put in the S tier. Next, as you can see, we're going to run with the Feral Druid, which has a really boring 2 set. It is just purely passive. Again, even with the 4 set, it's pretty passive. It's non-predictable as well, which I've heard a fair few Feral mains actually complain about. So it just seems like a weird tier set all around for the Feral Druid. I mean, you really wouldn't even notice that you had that tier set equipped, because it's just passive agility at this point, basically, if you didn't get the random generation of combo points. That being said, though, Feral is the best it's ever felt, in my opinion. If I could pick any class in the game, this would definitely be up there with the most complete specs in the game for me. You have an amazing AoE rotation, which you can also funnel into a huge single target as well through the Apex procs that you're getting. So the more targets with Rip on them, the better it feels. You have great cleave as well with spreading your rakes even quicker with your double clawed rake talent. It really just feels like they finally nailed the Feral Druid after all those years where we thought they were lost with it. My only problem with this spec is the fact that you're stuck in cat form the whole time. So I don't think personally I could ever main it, but for people that like that fancy, go ahead, because this spec feels unreal. And for that reason, we are going to place the Feral Druid also in the A tier, maybe just behind the Fury Warrior. I was umming and ahhing whether to put it in front of Fury, but I think based on also the tier set as well, we're going to place it just behind, because Fury does have a bit more engaging tier set. Now for a class that I have very little experience with, but I have picked it up recently, and I have been having an absolute blast. It's the Ret Paladin, of course. If you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. A lot of hype around this spec recently with obviously the rework that they've just had, and my god, does it feel good. This spec has never really stood out to me, but with the hype that's been around it recently, I've obviously had to level 1, see what the hype's all about, so I've got myself involved and I've been loving every second of it. You do, however, have a pretty boring tier set by the looks of things going into next patch. The 2 set, as far as I'm aware, is just damage, and also you have Hammer of Wrath hitting 4 nearby enemies. The 4 set could make your wings feel even greater just because of those Hammer of Wraths cleaving. It is already a very fun button to press. Having that 1-minute damage profile as Ret feels insane, and this is just going to beef up that even further, make it more fun to press, generate more holy power, do more damage, apply more judgments, all of that good stuff. So the 4 set is actually kind of good now that I'm thinking about it. Like I was saying, with the rework, they seem to have fixed a lot of Ret's problems. And one of my personal favorites of this spec is the fact that Judgment cleaves. I think it looks so sick when you fly out like 4 or 5 hammers. I can't remember exactly how many there are, but I just know it's a lot of hammers. Looks sick. Obviously, being a melee spec as well, there's going to be certain encounters where you're not going to be able to have full uptime on the enemy as a melee spec. Rhett kind of combats that because you can actually deal a lot of your damage from like a mid-range, I would say, so that feels great as well, just smoothing out the rotation, and then also being able to help out your group with the massive amounts of utility, off heals, and all that good stuff feels amazing. You really do feel like you're making a massive impact on your group. So again, I'm going to go with another A tier. I think I might even put this one, where do I want to put this one? I think I'm going to go above Feral. No, I'm going to go bottom of A. Just because I feel like maining it, you could end up a little bit bored because it is quite a simple rotation, although it feels amazing to play. But with the complexity that Feral brings, I don't feel like you could ever get bored of that spec unless like, you're like me and get bored of cat form. So regardless, we won't worry too much about how they're ranked within the tiers, but we've had 3 A tier specs so far, so it's looking good for next patch. And now that we've had a bit too much positivity, I think it's time for Frost Mage. The tier set's kind of a bit boring. It's just basically a recycled legendary from Shadowlands, just using a different ability instead. That one being the Glacial Fragments legendary. With the tier set, you're also getting extra Brain Freeze procs, which is always welcomed, but I don't really feel like it was that necessary for Frost Mage. However, I do feel like there is room for the Cold Front build to be opened up with this tier set, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But I know I played a lot of that Cold Front build at the end of Shadowlands when the Deathborn rotation was a thing, which actually felt quite good to press. The only thing I didn't really like was obviously you didn't press Ice Lance too much, so that feels like a bit of a wasted ability, and also the fact that you're not going to be this massive undead skeletal mage, so it might not feel as great in Dragonflight. However, that being said, there is a lot of new talents to play around with as well. But generally, I just feel like the rotation for Frost is pretty bland. To me, it feels quite nice on single target because you're going to be shattering your Frost Bolts into your Flurries, into the double Ice Lances. It's quite a nice little gameplay loop you've got there. But in AoE, I do just find it pretty sleeper. But we will have to see, obviously, which build ends up the best for Frost, because it could be the Cold Front Legendary, and that did feel good to have those Frozen Orbs just being spammed out one after the other. So that could beef up the AoE a little bit, but also the Snowstorm talent. I'm a big fan of the Snowstorm talent, just making that utility also be able to do damage at the same time, build up those stacks. The only thing I don't like about these sorts of talents or passive abilities is the fact that they kind of do require a weak aura. There's that, but generally I do quite like that talent. So I think I'm going to whack the Frost Mage in B tier for now. It could maybe be a C, so we're going to say like low B for now. I might re-jumble around some of them towards the end of the video. But for now, Frost Mage, B tier. Now, on to the next Frost spec. Would you believe it? No, you wouldn't. Frost DK I've always been quite a big fan of, weirdly. I know that is a weird opinion to some. A lot of you are probably clicking off the video now, and I don't blame you one bit, honestly. But also, the tier set for next season makes it look even more fun than it normally is for me. You can never go wrong with Frostworm's Fury as a Frost DK. That button feels amazing to press, so the more times you can proc or line up a Frostworm's Fury, the better. The 2 set and 4 set kind of plays into each other in the fact that it's all built around your Frostworm's Fury, but then that is also built into your Pillar of Frost, which is a very short cooldown on around a 40-second cooldown maybe. With the Ice Cap talent, it's already 1 minute, but with the Ice Cap talent, you can actually reduce the cooldown. So every 40 seconds, you're going to have a massive burst and pump window through your Frostworm's Fury. Maybe you'll even talent into Frostwhelp's Indignation, where you're going to summon some extra whelps as well. It could just make Pillar of Frost a really fun cooldown and a frequent cooldown to use, which I'm always a big fan of. Short cooldowns are great, especially in Mythic Plus. So that honestly sounds like a lot of fun to me. Frostworm's Fury is easily one of the best abilities in the game. Like when you see that fly out, you just know that you've flown to the top of the meters. So getting that more frequently at a reduced effectiveness, of course, but still, nevertheless, you're going to get that on top of your cooldowns at the same time. You can't really go wrong. That being said, though, I'm not actually sure if it's going to be the Breath or Obliteration build that you're going to be most optimal with next patch. I have a feeling it's going to lean towards Obliteration, but we will have to see how that actually plays out once all the sims and testing has been done. And the reason I've liked Frost all these years is pretty much because you basically just press the button that lights up. The abilities hit hard, they do big damn, and that equals big dopamine. So for the Frost DK, I'm actually going to whack this sucker at the top of B, just in front of their Frost counterpart. I think Frost DK takes the cake here. I'm not a huge fan of the Breath of Sindragosa playstyle, so I don't want to whack it in A just yet, but I think Frost DKs are going to be in a very good spot next tier. Onto the Havoc DH then. I know Demon Hunters aren't too happy with their tier set, and for good reason as well. It is just a purely passive tier set. You gain a little bit of I-beam damage here and there, but you're not going to play around it, so it's not going to change your gameplay. It is just purely passive. You won't even notice it. The damage will just go up here and there for your I-beams, depending on how much stacks you can generate. This tier set really does feel uninspired, so hopefully they change it. Hopefully they see the complaints about it and make it a little bit more interesting. You could have so much fun with the tier set for Demon Hunter. I don't know how they've messed it up. I'm also really not a fan of the momentum playstyle, and I know I won't be alone in saying that. I find it so cringe, and so do a lot of Demon Hunters. Demon Hunter is probably the most played DPS class, I'm pretty sure. And I know a lot of people are re-rolling from it or want to re-roll from it. So I think that tells you a lot about the spec in its current state. But outside of that, it is still a very fun spec. Like, I'm a huge fan of Ragefire, huge fan of Soul Rend as well, throwing out those glaives, making those part of the rotation. Just adds a bit more intricacy to the spec, always good. Now, Demon Hunter is probably arguably one of the hardest classes in the game, whereas it used to be complete brain dead. So in that sense, that is probably a good thing. I just feel like momentum does kill this spec. It's almost like an extra affix, especially in Mythic Plus, having to deal with your momentum uptime while dodging all the frontals, all the ground abilities and all that stuff. It just feels horrible. I do not want to play it at all purely because of momentum. Blizzard, change it now. So for Havoc Demon Hunters, I'm sorry people, I'm going to upset a lot of people here, but I don't think I'll be alone in saying that it's not in the greatest spot right now fun wise, so I'm going to whack it in the C tier, which is a massive change as well from my first fun tier list at the start of Dragonflight, where I had it easily in S tier. So I think that speaks for itself in the fact that momentum is very bad. Another spec I'm not too happy with going into the next tier or season, the Balance Druid. They are losing probably the best tier set they've ever had in terms of fun, gameplay, strength, power, all of that. I am in love with the season 1 tier set. I think it was amazing for the spec, really brought another level of depth to it as well. And now it's just going to be purely passive for the Balance Druid, getting some crashing stars, whatever they are, you won't even notice them. And some extra damage on your dots as well. It's really not looking like a good time for the Balance Druid, especially in single target, as this is mainly catered towards AoE. There's a few talent changes that they're getting going into 10.1 as well. You've got Wild Surges, which is going to increase your crit chance by a flat amount on your builders, so your Starfire and your Wraths. And this is going to feed into your Astral Smolder talent, which you're probably going to take for next season, because more crit on your builders equals more uptime on your Astral Smolder. So that is going to be your third dot that's proccing Waning Twilight instead of the Stellar Flare, which we've had, which I think is a good thing that we don't have to Stellar Flare on up to 20 targets or whatever stupid amount it was before. However, I don't like the fact that you're relying on RNG to get an 8% damage buff on each mob. That really doesn't feel good, so hopefully mushrooms will be the play, and then we can use that as our third dot and try and min-max with as much uptime we can get on the mushrooms. But I do feel like Stellar Flare is good for those low mob density dungeons where you've got like packs of 1 to 5. I really liked having to keep up an extra dot on there to get 8% extra damage of it. I used to hate Stellar Flare back in the day, but I feel like the Waning Twilight talent made the interaction with Stellar Flare quite a fun gameplay loop. It's not all doom and gloom for the Balance Druid. You do have extra CDR on your Fury of Elune, which is nice for some AoE damage and some AP gen as well. Orbit Breaker is an unreal talent. I'm so glad that they brought that from Torghast and actually implemented that into the talent tree. Proccing full moons in the middle of packs without actually having to cast a 4-second cast or whatever it is feels amazing. You get the AP gem from it, and you also get that massive impact of burst. And Pulsar is also another great addition to the talent tree for balance. I really like optimizing and min-maxing that buff, saving it for the next pack to open up with to get your ramp going quicker. So these kind of things do save the spec, although I do think it's going to be a lot worse than it was in season 1 just in terms of pure fun. I would have probably ranked it as like an S or A tier spec in season 1. But for season 2, we're going to go with the bottom of B, I think. It could even creep into C, honestly. Like, I'm really not looking forward to Balance Druid next season. It's going to be so brain dead in AoE. So that's going to be a lot of your Mythic Plus encounters, just spamming Starfire and Starfall. Your dots will take care of themselves, so it could even be a C tier, but for now I'll give it the benefit of the doubt, and also because it begins with a B, we'll put it in B. There we go. So next we have the Subtlety Rogue. It doesn't seem like the most interesting tier set in the world, I can't lie. You're going to get a lot more uptime on your Symbols of Death, potentially even perma uptime. I don't know how it's working at the moment. Nevertheless though, you're going to get a lot of uptime on your Symbols of Death, so that's going to feel great. A lot of crits, so you're going to get a lot of Find Weakness procs on the mobs, especially in mass AoE as well. That's going to feel great. Subs always had a great feedback loop, especially on single target in my opinion. Getting into those shadow dances as often as you can. Big old burst in those shadow dance windows. It is slightly more boring on AoE, but also if you do have a funnel target, then you can turn that AoE into prio funnel damage and just nuke down a big ad to get rid of it quicker. So that feels great because you know you're making an impact on the key. With that, your damage might be lower, but you are speeding up the key overall because those big chunky mobs are being taken down that much quicker. And for a rogue as well, you actually have some pretty incredible visuals in my opinion. I'm a big fan of the shadow dance animations. Shuriken Tornado, Shuriken Storm all look great as well. So sub in my opinion is quite a fun spec. It's just a shame that the tier set isn't doing too much for it next patch, so we're going to whack this one in the B tier as well, but we are going to put this one at the behind Frost DK but above Frost Mage. There we go. We'll separate the two. As you can see, I'm just winging these as I go along, but I think the Frostworm's Fury does carry the Frost DK just that little bit more than the Sub Rogue. Okay, so now on to a spec that I main for the first half of the season 1, I would say. We've got the Marksmanship Hunter. So the Marksmanship Hunter, you're going to get extra chance at proccing your death blows, which is just your free kill shots at any % health. So that is quite fun in of itself. However, the 4 set definitely needs some work. You're really not going to notice that 0.5 second CDR that it's going to give you as well. So Blizzard, get to work on that. But I do like these type of tier sets in the fact that they do open potential new talent builds for the specs. So you could end up taking Bombardment, which is getting a rework in 10.1 as well, which is going to make your kill shot grant you trick shots. However, even with that, I don't know how valuable that's going to be because you're going to want to multi-shot, whether it's going to be to spend your precise shot stacks or just get the damage out, because multi-shot is also getting a damage buff, so that's going to be big damage, especially in Mythic Plus. So that might not even change your rotation even if you take it, which means you probably wouldn't take it actually. Duh. And one of the things that I'm really excited about for Marksmanship Hunter is the fact that in single target at the moment, I'm pretty sure it's getting nerfed or already got nerfed, but you can get like a 70 to 80% uptime on your true shot in single target. So that feels amazing, firing off those aim shots and rapid fires back to back. That feels really good, especially on single target, which they were struggling with in the past. So it's nice to see that they're actually performing very well there. They could even potentially be the best hunter spec for single target in terms of performance, but we won't talk too much about that. But unfortunately, the massive thing for me that I just cannot stop thinking about is the loss of double tap. Still don't know to this day why they did that, because technically you were only getting 1 extra aim shot or rapid fire a minute. It was big burst, but most of your burst was coming from salvo anyway, so I feel like that was kind of irrelevant. Was it a PvP change? But I also did hear that it was because they didn't know how to buff aim shot and rapid fire, and it was much easier if double tap wasn't a thing, so they've got rid of it, which was the highlight of your rotation in my opinion for the Marksmanship Hunter. True shot windows feel good, but double taps, slinging off those rapid fires were amazing. And that is no more. So for me, the Marksmanship Hunter is going to go in the C tier. It is above Havoc, but it's just not quite there for me. Lack of visuals as well, just firing off arrows. I know some people are really into that fantasy, but they could just make it a bit more flashy, you know? So C tier for Marksmanship Hunter. On to the first of the Warlock specs and the best one. But don't say anything because I don't want to spoil the rest of the video. Okay, thank you. Absolute Giga Chad Demonology Warlock. With the tier set, it's looking insane power-wise, but also fun-wise because you're basically getting a melee Tyrant. It seems unreal, and hopefully they don't nerf the fun aspect of it, because I do feel like a power nerf might be coming at some point very soon. But you're getting the cooldown reduction on your Grimoire Felguard, which CDR in my opinion always feels nice. And now this is also going to line up with your Demonic Tyrant, so you're going to have 2 Tyrants out at the same time, buffing your damage, buffing your imps damage, doing damage themselves, doing prio damage, all of that. It's just going to feel unreal. And also really feeds into the whole class fantasy of Demo, which is, by the way, probably one of the best class fantasies in the game. Like, I'm tempted to even try and main this next season, I can't lie. Outside of your main cooldowns, you're flying imps in with implosions. You're getting back-to-back procs of Demonic Core, firing off those instant cast Demon Bolts. And also the cooldowns that you do have are on a short cooldown, which can, like I said, be reduced with CDR as well. And they are strong as well. It feels nice to have that impactful cooldown. Not naming any names, but there's some specs where you have cooldowns, but they don't really do any, like you don't really notice the difference when you press them. Whereas Demonology is the complete opposite. You know when you summoned your Tyrant, and you're gonna know when you summon your Grimoire Felguard at the same time and just completely obliterate the pack, do big damage, big old monsters everywhere doing damage for you. Amazing. S tier spec, no questions asked. On to Windwalker Monk then, which I know Windwalker mains don't seem to be too happy with the tier set for next season, but that's probably more from a power standpoint, because going Nova on your Rising Sun Kick sounds pretty cool to me. It was definitely bad when it was based on RNG because you weren't pressing it in AoE, so if you pressed it in AoE and then the Shadow Flame damage didn't proc, that would feel terrible, but they have changed that, so that's going to feel nice. It could be classed as counterintuitive because you never played or never pressed Rising Sun Kick in AoE before, so that's going to be something that Windwalkers are going to have to get used to. But this also could open the doors for Whirling Dragon Punch, because now you're going to have your Rising Sun Kick on cooldown and your Fist of Fury. So that might open that talent up, which I think is always a good time. Pressing that button feels really impactful and fun, but I don't know how that's going to work with the talent tree. I don't know if you can actually path down to it or if it's worth it. Obviously going to depend on damage numbers. It is unfortunate with the 4 set because it is just basically flat damage, but it does play back into the 2 set, so that's kind of nice. And just generally, Windwalker Monks have always had a fun rotation in my opinion. Never pressing the same button twice. Always keeps you thinking on your feet. You got unlimited amounts of mobility as well. You're summoning spirits, doing backflips and stuff like that. Unreal. So the Windwalker is fun in my books. I'm gonna rank it at the bottom of A, I think. Maybe just a bit above Paladin though, because it is quite a complex rotation. Zwen is sick when you summon him, so a big A tier for the Windwalker Monk. Next, we move on to the new hero class in this expansion, the Devastation Evoker. Now, a few of you might have seen that I did start a Zero to Hero series on the Devastation Evoker, and that lasted about 5 episodes, so I don't know if that tells you alone what I think of this spec, but going into Season 2, you are losing quite a fun tier set. I think proccing Lust from your 4 set in Season 1 was a great time, so that's definitely going to be missed. And in place of that, you're getting purely passive damage, which is buffed when you use your Dragon Rage, and also I think when you use your empowered abilities. Still boring, it's basically just Ignite. You're not doing anything. You can kind of min-max it, but not really. And it's just purely passive damage. Never a good thing for a spec. It is just so boring. But it is looking strong at the moment. But who knows, there's still about 2 or 3 weeks left until the next season, so we'll have to see how the tuning goes on that. The spec is quite fun up front because you're doing a lot of burst up front, like probably unmatched upfront burst in the game. Obviously helps with your mastery as well. But once you've got your burst rotation out of the way, it kind of just sends me to sleep. You've got your Pyre spam, you've got your Disintegrate spam on single target, which I think is more fun than the Pyre spam just because of the chances to proc your Eternity Surge. And also the clipping of your Disintegrates in Season 1 was quite fun to me as well. But I don't think that's the case anymore. You're getting a talent rework going into 10.1. Opens up a lot more talents because you're going to have a lot more talent points to use, as some of your nodes are being reduced in the amount of points you have to put into them but staying at the same power level, so that's probably quite good for the spec. But you probably are going to struggle with some of the talent reworks, like the extension on your Dragon Rage through Animosity. I know that's getting nerfed, so it's probably going to be harder to sustain your Dragon Rages. But you are getting haste as well at the same time from the extra stats, so it might even itself out a little bit. This spec is very mobile, so it does have that going for it. I think that's a lot of fun. Being able to use a lot of your abilities on the move while you're hovering is quite unique to the class, and I'm a really big fan of it. However, it is kind of held back by the fact that it's only got a 25-yard range. I really don't understand that. Like, when have you ever seen a dragon not be able to fire breath from a bloody across the world? But for some reason, evokers are limited to 25 yards. Feels horrible, it feels weird, feels like unnecessary. I don't know why they've done that, so hopefully in the future, if people complain enough, they will change that. But yeah, going into next season, I think I'm going to put the Devastation Evoker in the top of C. It's flashy, it has a lot of nice visuals, but once you've got your burst out the way, it's just a very stale, boring, simple, what's another word for boring, simple, just like bland rotation, you know? So top of C. It's got some fun parts to the spec, but it definitely could use some work in other spots. Speaking of, a pretty bland and boring spec. Now, I've been fighting for this spec for a long time during this whole season because the Beast Mastery Hunter has been my main in Season 1. I got to 3 KIO on it, so I'd like to think I know my way around the spec. I know what you're thinking, oh, it's not hard, it's only Beast Mastery Hunter. But there is definitely some more intricacies going into Dragonflight with the new talents. So try it before you buy it. That being said though, after a whole season of maining it, it did get a bit stale towards the end for me. It just doesn't really have like the wow factor in its rotation. These are one of those specs that I was talking about where it's just kind of flatline damage. Like nothing really happens when you press your cooldowns. Yeah, you get extra damage, but you don't even really notice it, especially as you have such a high uptime on it. And this is where it kind of gets me questioning, do I think CDR is always fun for specs? Because this spec has a lot of CDR. You're getting 12 seconds off of your main cooldown every time you press Barb Shot, and you're getting even more CDR with the tier set for next season. But when you press Bestial Wrath, nothing really happens. So that's got me questioning myself a bit with my criteria there. But yeah, it just needs like a wow factor. For example, there is a build that's potentially opening up with Aspect of the Wild. Although I don't think I really want to be pressing Cobra Shot, it would have that wow factor where you're firing out 3 Cobra Shots, reducing your cooldown on Bestial Wrath even more. Like that would feel nice instead of just flat damage, right? There is quite a lot of potential with this spec. Like you also have your Call of the Wild talent where you're summoning loads of beasts. I think Blizzard need to dive in on that gameplay fantasy right there. Just summon all your beasts from the stables, get them to do all the damage. That feels amazing. And even just on single target with your talents like your Dire Pact, just being able to spam kill command back to back to back to back with PI and Bloodlust feels bloody pog champ. So there is a lot of potential for the spec, but unfortunately the OP build is just going straight down the middle, taking the boring 35% crit damage or 30% pet crit damage. I can't remember what it is, but it's just a boring talent. It's probably always going to be the best just because of how it's laid out. So it definitely did get old towards the end of the season for me. Going into next season, we have a boring 2 set with just flat kill command and Cobra Shot damage, buffing up our single target even more. Not that we really need it. And like I touched on a minute ago, with the 4 set, we're getting more CDR and Bestial Wrath, but it doesn't really feel that impactful. Obviously, it is a lot of damage, but it just doesn't feel like anything changes when we press it. So from a fun standpoint, it's really not all that great. So for the Beast Mastery Hunter, I'm going to whack this one at the bottom of B tier along with the Balance Druid. This one's going to be above Hunter just because, like I touched on, there are a few fun talent combinations, and also the fact that you get to do your full rotation on the move is pretty underrated for the spec on how fun it is. So B for Beast Mastery Hunter. Next we go for the Survival Hunter, which I actually had a little play around with on the PCR the other day. Had a lot of fun. It's also looking very, very strong. Going into 10.1, they've changed Lunge, which is your extra melee range on your attacks. They've actually changed that to now reduce the cooldown of your wildfire bombs by 1 second as well. Like I said, for everything except Beast Mastery Hunter, CDR is always welcome. You get even more CDR as well from your 4 set, which is actually a quite respectable amount of CDR that you're getting on your bombs. You can pretty much just spam them, especially in AoE. The 2 set is also going to buff up your kill command damage as well, so that's a nice little interaction. Although when I played it, and I'm no expert, but when I played it, I felt like I couldn't always weave in the kill command, so that's definitely going to be interesting. But yeah, a really fun spec. I do also like the fact that it's semi-ranged as well, so you can throw those bombs, those kill shots if you're away from the mobs, use your kill commands as well. Huge fan of the single target rotation as well, dumping all those Mongoose Bites into those Mongoose Fury windows, stacking up those big ones. We are unfortunately losing the fun tier set from Season 1 as well, where you're able to pump even more Mongoose Bites into those Mongoose Fury windows and deal more damage. But regardless, it's still a fun rotation. So for the Survival Hunter, I'm actually going to whack this one at the top of the B tier. I like having a pet as well. That's always a plus for me. But you're not too much based around your pet. Obviously, you got your kill command, your coordinated assault, and your flanking strike, utilizing your pet, but it's not purely based around your pets. You also see your pets as well, like you don't with Beast Mastery Hunter, because you're stood 40 yards away. Your pets are in the middle of 15 mobs, so you can't see what's going on. But with Survival, you're right there in the action, throwing your bombs, getting your butcheries out, kill shot cleaving as well, just feels unreal. So a very good and probably the most fun hunter spec for me. Next, Unholy Death Knight. I know, again, Unholy DKs are not too happy with their tier set going into next patch, although it has been reworked and buffed here and there. So you're now going to get instant 20 stacks of Master of Death when you summon your Army of the Dead. So that's going to be nice for some on-demand burst. But at the end of the day, it is just Mastery that you're getting. So it's not too much in the way of fun there. But summoning an army of zombies can never not be fun, can it? So, Unholy is definitely one of the more fun specs for me. You have lots of frequent mini cooldowns as well. You got Dark Transformation buffing up your pet and doing big damage. You can spread out all your diseases, pop all your wounds, burst them all at the same time, massive damage. Even if it didn't do massive damage, it would still be very fun in my opinion. You also have 3 different diseases that you put out now, which I think is a nice little touch on the class fantasy. Depending on the build you play as well, Viral Contagion is a new talent that's come into Dragonflight, and I think that talent is a lot of fun. Just being able to instantly spread out those wounds and then pop them all at the same time for massive damage feels unreal. There's a lot of ramp to this spec, but if the mobs live long enough, then it does always definitely pay off. And there is also quite a lot of build variety as well, which I haven't really touched on yet, but I think that is definitely a great factor into making a spec fun, is being able to switch up your talents depending on which dungeon you're playing, which encounter you're doing, etc, etc. So you can play like a gargoyle build for more single target, or you can go for the wound or disease build. Each of them have their strengths and weaknesses, so you can decide before the key which one you want to play, even depending on maybe which group comp you're running as well. So there's lots of room for variety there, keeping the spec fun and fresh. The only downside for me with Unholy is a lot of your damage comes from your pets, and a lot of it is also your melee attacks from your pets as well, specifically in single target. So that doesn't feel great. I know it's obviously you that's summoning them and doing all the hard work, but then they're getting all the credit for it. What's that about? So that is my one gripe with the spec, but it is nevertheless very fun. So I'm going to whack this one in A tier as well. I'm not really going to concentrate too much on where they're ranked within the tiers. If they're in A tier, it means they're pretty goddamn fun. Arcane Mage is a bit of a weird one for me. I haven't got too much experience with this spec, but I've got a few friends that play it, and I haven't heard great things, honestly. But in saying that, the cooldown phases of Arcane does look very fun. It's also very unique in its playstyle as well, being one of the only DPS specs that actually uses mana as a resource. The 2 set as well, you're going to get increased cooldown duration, so that's always a positive. And you're going to get increased mana regeneration outside of it. I'm not too familiar with how it works, but basically I think that's going to bridge the gap a little bit between inside and outside your cooldowns. So you're going to be able to have more powerful mini burns as well outside of your cooldowns. Arcane Echo, in my opinion, is one of the best looking abilities in the game. Just seeing that constantly pulsing while you're firing out your missiles and barrages and all that good stuff looks pretty darn cool to me. So that's a W. And if you can execute the insane burst properly, then that feels unreal. Like, there's few classes in the game that can burst as hard as Arcane Mage. However, from what I've heard and from what I've seen, it is quite hard to pull off that burst perfectly, especially when you've got affixes, mechanics, mobs all around you, messing it all up, putting extra pressure on you. So it is hard to execute, but if you can do it, it is a lot of fun. So for the Arcane Mage, I am going to put it just slightly in front of Frost, but not too high up. We're going to go for the B tier for the Arcane Mage. Another spec that seems to be trying to bridge the gap from inside and outside their cooldowns next season with their tier set is the Assassination Rogue. It seems weird to me because ideally you want to pop everything on top of each other with Lust and go ham, but for these specs they're making you do more damage outside of your cooldowns as well, which is very interesting. We'll see how it plays out. The 2-piece and 4-piece do feed into each other with the extra nature damage, so that is nice, although it's kind of quite passive, so nothing too fun to report there. But yeah, like I said, it seems to be smoothing out the damage pattern, which is making for another flatline-ish rogue spec where they don't really have too many peaks and troughs, which I feel like Assassination definitely used to have. Obviously, we've been used to Vendetta for so long, which got reworked to Deathmark this season, or expansion, I should say. So it's just basically homogenizing all of their damage profiles between all the rogue specs, so you don't really have too much differentiation, and Assassination's in a bit of a tricky spot anyway, especially with Mythic Plus competing with Sub and Outlaw Rogue. So with their damage profiles looking closer and closer together, it's looking even worse for the Assassination Rogue. AoE definitely feels a lot better this expansion. expansion. I know I was a huge fan in beta of Assassination Rogue with the new Indiscriminate Carnage talent. Getting those ruptures out, getting that burst out, generating you more energy throughout the encounter was always fun. And that was something that I always had a gripe with about the Assassination Rogue, was the fact that it was a slow gameplay style, especially on single target. You're basically just waiting for your energy to regen so that you can spend it again. The only other drawback of this spec is the fact that it seems like a lot of work for average results when you could just respec to Outlaw or Sub. I know a lot of people will like that being like the underdog spec and performing better than other specs, but for me, absolutely slamming my head into the keyboard and just coming out subpar doesn't feel too great. And for that reason, I think I'm going to put the Assassination Rogue at the bottom of C tier. I'm not too heavy into the dot-based gameplay styles that some of these specs do bring. I definitely do prefer the burstier specs, so Assassination isn't helped with that cause, unfortunately, so it's bottom of C tier so far. Fire Mage is another spec that has definitely grown on me recently. I mained Fire Mage back in the start of Shadowlands, but haven't really touched it since. I played a little bit of it on beta, but I wasn't too impressed with it. However, seeing it develop over the course of the season, it really has caught my eye, and I've started leveling 1, and I might play a bit of it next season. Although, tier set, not looking great for the spec. Just tier sets in general for the mage specs aren't great, but specifically for fire. The big splash damage you do get from the buffed Phoenix Flames could feel okay, but as far as I'm aware, Phoenix Flames isn't something that you really want to play around. It's on the global cooldown, whereas Fire Blast isn't. It doesn't always guarantee a crit, so it can mess up with your hot streaks. And it also has travel time as well, so it just feels quite clunky for the spec as far as I'm aware, and people aren't a big fan of it. So buffing that and making that the core of the spec seems interesting. Again, I don't really like it when they're trying to like pigeonhole people into a build and make them play that. People should be able to generally play what they want, and the tier set should probably buff the spec as a whole and not certain talents or spells. I'm also not sure how it's going to work with the talent from the Ashes, I think it's called, where you get extra mastery for every charge of Phoenix Flames that's not actually been used. So there might even be a build, if it doesn't get buffed accordingly, that you just leave your Phoenix Flames on cooldown to get the mastery and you don't even end up using the tier set. Can't really see a world where that happens, but never say never. Outside of just the tier set then, I personally am a really big fan of Pyroclasm and Sun King's Blessing as well. Getting more frequent combustions is always good because fire has always struggled with being one of those specs that relies on how the tank and group pulls. So getting more frequent combustions for every single pack is a really good thing in my opinion, and it kind of smooths out the spiky damage profile of the Fire Mage. And then you've got your Pyroclasms charging up those big old meaty pyroblasts and hitting for like stupid amounts of damage is always a good feeling, as long as you can actually get them off. But then that has been made easier as well with either taking ice flows or shimmer. The other drawback of playing Fire Mage specifically in Mythic Plus is the fact that you can't really have fun until you get to about a plus 22 key, because the mob that your ignite spreading from just literally gets deleted off the face of the planet. So you can't pump a big old ignite and then spread it to the rest of the group for massive damage until the mobs start living long enough. So that is definitely a drawback of the spec, but that also is countered by the fact that it makes it a very good class at taking down those prio mobs and then cleaving for massive damage at the same time. Like, you can't really ask for a better damage profile in Mythic Plus, but we'll speak about that more in the DPS meta predictions that I'm going to be doing soon. So all in all, I think I'm going to go for top of the B tier for Fire Mage. It would be higher, but unfortunately the tier set for next season really is just holding it back at this point. It definitely needs a rework or even just a buff at this point to make Phoenix Flames feel rewarding to press, because at the moment I know people aren't happy with pressing it. So yeah, if they do fix that, then it definitely could climb the ranks, as I do feel like it's a very fun spec outside of that. Lots to min-max, lots of damage. Combustion feels amazing and looks amazing. So without any borrowed power, this spec is definitely up there. On to Shadow Priest then, with I think it's probably about their 17th millionth rework at this point. I would be fuming if I was a Shadow Priest, I can't lie. Tier set seems to be feeding much more into the Psychic Link gameplay, which again, pigeonholing people into a build isn't too amazing, but as far as I'm aware, you've been taking that for the whole of Dragonflight anyway. I personally don't mind it. I think it's a really fun talent, feeding those spells into your prio target and then passively cleaving with the rest of it with anything that has vampiric touch on it. I think that feels great, and it also makes for some min-maxy playstyle. Full set, pretty boring, basically just damage on your Devouring Plague and buffing up your shadowy apparitions as well. But outside of that, I haven't played too much Shadow Priest myself, but from what I hear, a lot of people always say this is one of the most fun range specs they've ever played. I think the combination of dots, and they finally seem to have sort of mastered the bursty windows, especially with the Shadow Crash applying dots, making for quicker ramp times, which Shadow Priest has always struggled with, so they've kind of bridged that gap, and I think the combination of dots and burst together and the off-heals utility that it brings really fleshes out the spec and makes it fun. Extra instant cast Mind Blast from the 2 set as well. That sounds quite fun to me. I don't know about you guys, but if all goes well with the rework, then I think Shadow's going to be in a good spot next season. It's looking very strong numbers-wise on the PTR as well. I'm very happy as well that they actually went back on themselves and didn't commit to the Shadow Fiend and Mindbender tier set that they originally planned to do, because I think they are the most cringe pets in the world. Like, if anything, the Shadow Fiend should be the thing from beyond that you actually spawn. I think that could make Shadow Fiend look pretty sick, but the small shard just running across the floor. Ugh, I hate it. Get out of here. So, yeah, I'm glad that they did go back on that. And although it's still a boring 4 set, I think that's better than emphasizing more on the pet aspect of Shadow Priest. I don't think it should be a pet class at all. So for the Shadow Priest, I am going to go for the A tier. Fingers crossed the rework goes well, eh? Next, we'll move on to the Arms Warrior, which the tier set at first, buffing up the slam damage, seemed really lackluster and also clunky. We're not even pressing slam at this point. We're dumping our rage into ignore pain instead. So thank God they changed it to Mortal Strike Cleaving, which was already a massive portion of your damage as well, so that feels even better to press, and also doesn't bloat your rotation out too much because you're probably going to press it anyway, especially with sweeping strikes up. So that's a W change for the Arms Warrior. I am a really big fan of this new Arms Warrior playstyle that's sort of like a cyclical, methodical playstyle where you're cycling your Cleave, your Whirlwind, your Thunderclap, your Blade Storms, and all that good stuff, keeping up your Dance of Death. I think that's what it's called, the strength you get from Blade Storm. Keeping that is at max stacks as often as you can. Lots to min-max with this spec, which is always a good thing in my books. And I touched on Blade Storm just then, which obviously it does feel great to press Blade Storm, but if you sit back and think about it, when you've pressed that button, yeah, you're doing big damage, but you're not doing anything for 6 seconds. I'm sure it gets to a point with this spec where you're just bored of looking at your character spin in circles and get dizzy. So if they can make something happen during Blade Storm, then I think that can make this spec go up in my rankings even further, because I am a thorough enjoyer of the Arms Warrior. Although saying that on single target, it is kind of boring. Boring and does no damage. That is never a good combination. At least for Mythic Plus anyway. I know in single target, that Fatality talent looks like heaps of fun, just stacking up a massive execute and then imagine critting on that as well. I'm pretty sure it's one of the hardest hitting abilities in the game, and that can never be a bad thing either, can it? So that's a W for Arms in pure single target, but unfortunately you don't take that into Mythic Plus, so I don't really want to comment too much on that. But I've always kind of slept on Arms. I always thought it was quite boring, but playing it recently, I've been having a lot of fun, and especially once you stack up that haste as well, the rotation becomes very smooth, very fluid. So for the Arms spec, I'm going to put this one at the top of the B tier. Unfortunately, it is just that single target holding it back from the A tier, I think. In general, I do prefer playing Fury, although Arms is definitely a nice change of pace from Fury when your arms and fingers need a rest from button mashing the whole time. And that's what I love about Warrior as well, is you have 2 very different playstyles from Fury to Arms, so you can pick and choose when you want to play each one. If you're feeling a bit more calm, then you play Arms. If you're feeling juiced to the gills, you just add a Monster Energy drink, you play Fury. A spec that I consider quite close to the Fury Warrior as well is the Outlaw Rogue. I haven't played any this season, unfortunately. I did play quite a lot in beta though. Going into Season 2, the tier set doesn't seem too fun for the Outlaw Rogue, although I guess it does kind of beef up your Between the Eyes shot. So it's going to make that feel extra chunkier to press, which is probably a good thing, but other than that, it's pretty passive in terms of a tier set, although it does sound like it's going to be very, very strong. Hopefully it cleaves as well with your Blade Flurry, although I'm not convinced it's going to at this point, as it does specify that it's Between the Eyes that procs it. Outlaw is another one of those specs that I will class in the same boat as Beastmaster, with the CDR not really mattering too much, although the perk that Outlaw has is that everything gets cooldown reduction on it, or pretty much everything gets cooldown reduction on it, so that does feel great. But Adrenaline Rush, other than speeding up your rotation a little bit, doesn't really do too much, so getting the CDR on that doesn't feel too impactful, although that being said, it's definitely more impactful than the Beastmaster. Lots to min-max on this spec. The rotation itself is pretty simple, but once you master that, you then have to master your crowd control as a rogue. So you're never a master in this spec, which in my opinion is a good thing. You've always got something to strive towards, always got something to improve at. The one thing that does draw me back from this class though, or spec I should say, is the lack of animations and also the boring sound effects. Like, yeah, some people I'm sure get get on with the slashy sound effects, but after a while they just sound the same. Like, I would probably mute them if I was an outlaw main, because it does get a bit monotonous, but really fun gameplay. You've got that gambling aspect in it, which is always good fun. It's not too impactful anymore to where you just have to sit there and re-roll your buffs. They've kind of balanced it pretty perfectly, or as perfectly as they could. You've got the cooldown as well, where you can extend your buffs. So if you get a 5 buff, I mean, there is no better feeling. I mean, it's hard to beat the feeling of getting a 5 buff. When you do get that 5 buff, Outlaw is definitely an S tier fun spec, but obviously you're not always going to get that. That being said though, it wouldn't be good to always get that, because then that would be the normal and you wouldn't feel on top of the world when you do get that 5 buff. And with that cooldown, like I was just talking about, you can now extend that 5 buff, so that always feels amazing. Really complete spec. The only other issue I have is that your rotation doesn't really change other than pressing Blade Flurry and Blade Rush, because you're just literally translating your single target damage into AoE through your Blade Flurry ability. So it would be nice to have some flavor just purely for an AoE rotation, but nevertheless, I do always have a great time when I play this spec, and my brain is on bloody overdrive. And for that reason, we're going to place Outlaw at the top of the B tier. Onto the Shaman specs then. We'll start with the Elemental Shaman. Their tier set from a design perspective and a fun standpoint is peak tier set performance. Getting a free Stormkeeper every 40 seconds is going to feel unreal. Big damage, big AoE, big zaps bloody everywhere. Although hopefully it doesn't proc too much outside of combat, because if your tank's not in a rush to pull the next pack, then that charge might go to waste, and that's going to feel bloody awful. You're going to generate some extra Maelstrom from your 4 set in a single target scenario as well, so that's going to feel nice, although I don't think it's too necessary, but it will smooth out the rotation just that bit more. You're going to get some extra crit damage from your AoE abilities as well, which is passive, pretty boring, but overall an amazing tier set in terms of design. For both of the Shaman specs, you've got unreal audio and visual cues. I don't think there's a better spec or class in the game that has any better animations or audio feedback. Deeply Rooted Elements is one of the most fun talents in the game for me. Getting that Ascendance proc, literally my PogChamp in real life every time that happens, specifically on enhancement though, but same goes for Elemental. It is a great feeling. And the only thing with the Elemental Shaman is it kind of feels a little bit clunky to me. I'm not an expert on it, so it might just be because I'm bad. But it feels like you have so many buttons to press, so many procs to consume. It feels like you're munching other procs with other abilities. It just does get a bit overwhelming at times. So that's a bit of a drawback for me. But once maybe I master it or get good at it, then maybe that will feel a lot better. But with where I'm at for Shaman right now, Elemental does feel definitely clunkier. That being said though, I am still in love with the specs. So we are going to put this bad boy in the top of the B tier. I think the audio and visual feedback these specs give you could carry these specs alone, even if they did nothing outside of that. Whoever designs these Shaman specs needs a bloody raise. So as you probably gathered, I'm a big Shaman fan, possibly a main for next season. So that means the enhancement is going to be placed quite high as well. The tier set, you're getting a mastery bonus from your 2 set, which isn't too fun, pretty passive, pretty boring, but it is making Sundering into a mini cooldown, which you're going to have pretty much up for every single pack in Mythic Plus. So that's going to feel amazing. The only kind of question that I can ask with this is Sundering at the moment is used quite a lot for its crowd controlling potential. So now it's going to feel bad holding it, because that's going to be extra damage that you could be putting out. You're going to want to get this on cooldown as much as you can throughout a dungeon to get the most value out of it. But then you're going to lose the AoE stop that you get with it. So in higher keys, this could definitely feel bad, but I do think it makes up for it with the 4 set. Getting those extra giga strong chain lightnings is going to feel amazing. It is 2 now. It just got nerfed, I think, last night from 3 extra chain lightnings that get giga buffed, and it's going to refund that Maelstrom as well, or 50% of it, I should say. So that little gameplay loop there every 40 or 45 seconds, whatever Sundering cooldown is, feels amazing on top of the already amazing rotation that Enhancement has. If you guys saw my last tier list, then you'll know that I was a massive fan of Enhancement Shaman at the start of this expansion. I put it S tier above everything else because the gameplay was just amazing. You have so many different varieties of builds that you can play as well. You've got the Elementalist, you've got the physical build as well. And I think even for next season, you might be playing into Deeply Rooted Elements and Thorim's Invocation. I've seen a few builds with that, and that is my ultimate build right there. That is so fun. Just spamming those wind strikes, firing out those chain lightnings on the same global feels amazing. Getting Deeply Rooted Element procs as well feels even better than Elemental on your Enhancement Shaman because you're doing massive AoE damage at the same time. So Enhancement Shaman for me still stands in very good stead, and I, for that reason, am going to put this at the top of S tier. Again, please try this spec out if you haven't already. It is heaps of fun. Even if the rotation was just pressing Crash Lightning, you'd have an absolute blast because that visual feedback is amazing. So big W for the Enhancement Shaman. And last but not least, but maybe sort of kind of least, we have the last two Warlock specs. Athlock's tier set for next season looks quite nice. You're getting some CDR on your frequent burst, and this makes it line up better with your other cooldowns as well. So that's huge for the Affliction Warlock, helping increase the ramp time as well that Affliction's always struggled with. You're basically just getting flat down from the 4 set as well, which isn't too fun, but we're used to that at this point with all the other tier sets that we've been through. To be fair, this is quite a fun spec. You can min-max all of your different dots on multiple targets, and it feels very rewarding keeping up your dots 100% uptime on a multitude of targets, spamming out those Seeds of Corruptions for massive AoE damage that we've seen from the Affliction lock in Season 1. You can snipe extra soul shards from dying mobs, which allows you to really min-max your gameplay and take it to that next level. So it is a really high skill ceiling for this spec, which I think is always a good thing. And even for a dot spec, they do have some quite nice visuals. I do feel bad for whoever designs Affliction lock, because think of a cool looking design for a dot that instantly gets applied to a mob that's 40 yards away from you. You're not really going to be able to see it, but I feel like they did a good job with that. Like I said earlier, I'm not a huge fan of dot playstyles. I prefer the burstier specs, but Affliction does a good job of being a dot spec, so I'm going to whack this one in the B tier. I think I'm going to go just above Arcane and Frost, which are quite bursty specs, so that says that it's a good design. You got some nice interactions with the talents. The Dark Glare cooldown actually does damage now, so that feels great compared to what it used to feel like, and Warlocks are pretty sick. And after just saying that, I'm going to completely contradict myself with Destro Warlock. I think out of all specs in the game, Destro Lock is probably one of the specs that people are most unhappy about regarding the tier set for next season. I'm going to be even more of a hypocrite here because, like I've said, it's horrible to build on and pigeonhole people into playing a talent, but that is exactly what Demo and Affliction Lock have done, but they've just done it with better talents. Destro Lock is being forced to play Channel Demon Fire next season, which nobody plays at the moment. It feels clunky to play. You have to sit and be stationary, which Destro has to do anyway, and it doesn't look that powerful either. All it does is increase your damage by a flat amount, so it's very passive, very boring. In AoE, Destro Lock isn't the most fun spec in the world either. You get a few immolates out, and after that, it's just summon your Infernal, which, to be fair, Infernal is a sick cooldown, especially with the purple Infernal as well. But after that, it's just Rain of Fire spam. So you got to pray that your tank stays in the same spot and also that the mobs live long enough. So that's an L for the Destro Lock right there. Single target's a bit better in my opinion, although it is just your generic builder and spender. But Chaos Bolt does make up for it because it looks unreal. It's probably one of the best looking abilities in the game. But it's looking pretty doom and gloom for Destro so far next season. And for that reason, I'm out. C tier, almost the bottom of C tier, not quite the Assassination Rogue. I think Chaos Bolt and Purple Infernal pretty much saves it, but yeah, that is where I'm going to rank it. So that is my tier list based on the specs at the bottom that are going to send me to sleep, and the specs on the top that feel like I'm on top of the bloody world. There's still a few weeks left until season 2 of Dragonflight, so there's definitely room for improvement in terms of fun for these specs. But at this current moment, this is where I would rank these specs for now. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with this tier list and where you would place your spec, and potentially other specs if you have dabbled with other specs and think they're more fun than I placed them or less fun than I placed them. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe to your boy if you're new, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.